Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Ramble Mosey. Whether you're joining us from the treadmill, from behind the wheel of your car, or just chilling in your office today, excited to spend a little bit of time with one of our favorite co-hosts, and actually one of our favorite friends, Megan Motil. Megan is the founder and chief thinker behind Parallel Solutions. You've heard us reference Parallel a number of times as we've been spending time with you. And Parallel is a boutique consulting firm out of Traverse City, Michigan, which focuses really intently on organizational development and also forward thinking, both with organizations and government entities. And so wanted to spend a little bit of time today, both unpacking some of the assumptions that Megan and I often bring to these conversations, but also a look to the future and thinking about what's next for conservation in Michigan and the Great Lakes region, and then also some of the forces that are impacting those things. Megan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan.
Yeah. I think we often, in the closing byline, it's always references thought leadership by Parallel Solutions, and that couldn't be more true. I think you have your hands in a number of organizations' identity around the state, for sure, around the Great Lakes. And I think a lot of us owe you a debt of gratitude for that.
Oh, thanks. Feel lucky to work with so many great folks.
So around 3 years ago, listeners will remember that Megan had worked with Heart of the Lakes and the Conservation Fund and the Mott Foundation to pull together some thoughts around what the state of urban conservation looks like in Michigan. And we'll circle back to that in a little bit to see what 3 years has brought us. But maybe to kind of frame things, Megan, we often talk about land conservancies, and we use that term often, or land trusts, sometimes replaced with conservation orgs, depending on the level of the conversation. Like, who are these things? What are these things?
Well, land conservancies, often called land trusts, they use very specific tools in their conservation work, including conservation easements on private land that are still owned by the landowner, but the public benefit of the conservation values is protected forever. They also own land outright, fee simple property, as preserves or sanctuaries, and sometimes as places where other folks can access nature. And they also work with public entities to protect natural areas that are then owned by units of government and open for the public to enjoy. So land conservancies in the universe or ecosystem of conservation, those are the tools they kind of lean into the most.
And am I correct? You're working with land conservancies, not just in the Great Lakes, but across the country at that point. Is that right?
Yeah. I pretty much, I don't usually cross the Mississippi River, but I do work with land trusts on the East Coast, Southeast, in the Midwest and Great Lakes.
I just had a great Mark Twain image in my head of you fording the Mississippi River, so we'll leave that one.
Yeah. The only time I see the folks on the other side of the Mississippi is when I go to Raleigh.
Right on. Parallel Solutions is your vision, literally, like crafted into existence in a very particular, specific way. Can you share with us a little bit about the origin of Parallel and then also the intentionality that you bring with it?
Yeah, I started my company a little over 10 years ago, and it really was a way for my passions for community development, conservation, and organizational development to come together. So I like to call myself a recovering planner. I started my career as a regional planner doing transportation and land use and economic development planning here in Northwest Lower Michigan. And I loved that job because it gives you this landscape level view of different, just in different elements of how communities come together, whether it's, the way we're using land for housing, for commercial development, what we're protecting for water quality, what our work shed, how's labor flow moving in and out of a place, and, how do we take care of folks and take care of the systems and services they need within a broader region? So what drew me to planning was that systems level thinking and acting. And, within planning, there's often not a lot of acting. And I think that was the frustrating part for me about planning was, you do a lot of studies and you do a lot of research, you create maybe visions or goals. And then oftentimes, if you're a planner, that's sort of where your role stops. So I I enjoyed that work. I had some really great mentors and some folks I worked with there, but I found myself wanting a little more action. And I was really fortunate that a position came open at the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy. This was back in 2007 for a director of communications job. And I thought, wow, that mission is amazing. I want to go work for that mission and work with those people. And if you know Glenn Chown, he's very charismatic. Like I had seen him speak. I was really inspired by him. So I applied for that job and they hired me. And I ended up working there first as the director of communications, then as the development director and deputy director, like COO role. And I was there for 7 years. And I left there in 2014. And I just kind of combined all my passions together for community development and conservation. And, the folks I'm working with now are working in all those same spaces that I was working in before. So I have conservation clients, including land trusts, but I'm also working with folks who are working on housing, multimodal transportation, economic development, and sometimes the intersection of those things.
When I think it's that intersection that gets lost so often, right? I mean, and you and I have talked about this a lot offline. The I know what my work is. Some of our colleagues refer to it as sticking to your knitting, and it's sort of like that's great. Like there is definitely focus on nonprofit mission in particular and municipal mission, but oftentimes that becomes sidewalls never to be broached versus guiding mission and vision.
Yeah, it's hard too to work across sectors. Even if you want to, there's so many barriers to that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even recently in just the public health and conservation conversations, terminology has come up as such a strong divider where the two sectors are talking about the exact same things, but using literally a different word to describe the exact same physical feature. And the two groups sitting there staring at each other like, well, I don't know what you mean, based solely on semantics. And so it breaks down even quicker from there. Where are you seeing some bright spots around Michigan, the Midwest, in your work? Who name drop if you want, but who's doing things well, or where are you seeing some cool opportunities?
Oh, well, I feel like every single one of my clients inspires me. So I'm working there are folks doing great things all over the state of Michigan. I think, we've got folks working on dam removals and river restoration, both in the Boardman area, Boardman River Valley, Ottawa River, and also over in the northeast part of the state, Huron Pines folks. We've got seed savers everywhere. I mean, there and folks who are, almost every conservation district has a native plant sale they're running every year. And I just feel like that local focus and direct landowner action is really inspiring. We've got folks in Southeast Michigan who are working on, huge challenges related to areas of concern, doing sort of massive restoration, cleanup efforts there in places like the Detroit and the Rouge River. And just a lot of really cool partnerships around farmland and forest land protection, both in, the Ann Arbor area and also over in Southwest Michigan. And all of those things are inspiring. There's so many good stories out there. I think it's really hard. A lot of these folks are small nonprofits or small units of government who they don't have communications and marketing staff, right? So a lot of times I feel like the stories are there. They're just not the stories that we hear most often. But I feel like those stories are everywhere around the state.
I think that's a really good point, right? Like the stories are there. We don't necessarily hear about them, or there aren't necessarily the mechanisms to push them out as widely as we need to.
Mm-hmm.
Are there places, or where are the places you're seeing folks have the ability to share those stories even at the lowest level? Are there gathering spots or the gathering places where people can do that, even if it's one-to-one conversation?
Yeah, I do think there are, circles where people share those stories. And sometimes if it's conservation groups getting together, oftentimes I see those groups get together through the watershed planning process that happens. So in those types of processes, you've got conservation districts at the table. Oftentimes it's a watershed council leading that kind of effort, another nonprofit organization focused on water quality protection. But the land conservancies are there too. And they're part of that process as folks working on the land protection part of water quality protection. And then you've got other partners there, like units of government, including cities, villages, townships, counties, sometimes road commissions, sometimes tribes. And I find that, and sometimes lake associations too, volunteers just showing up because they care about their lake. So I do think there are spaces like that at the watershed or sub-watershed level where people are working together and they understand what other folks are doing and they're trying to get on the same page in terms of creating a course of action to protect something together. So I don't know if those stories really make it out of those circles a lot, but I do feel like those things are happening and those circles are there.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? Because the place, whether it's a lake, whether it's a piece of land, whether it's a trail, whether it's a neighborhood, whatever the it might be, the sort of place-based advocacy, place-based activism around those things means that there's a high level of energy devoted to supporting that place or that geography or that particular sort of function. And so then how we try and bridge the different enthusiasm bubbles becomes both the opportunity and I think the challenge sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's just a challenge of the way our system is set up too. I mean, especially in Michigan, we have really fragmented local government. So there's not really one place where those conversations can happen, even at the government level, because we've got these, every 6 miles we have a different entity who has authority for land use, planning, and regulation. So if you're a watershed council or a land trust, you're having the same conversation, even within one county, maybe 10 times about land protection. And that just takes a lot of energy to share that message, build those relationships, and maintain them. So I think part of it's our system and just how the structure is set up that makes some of this so complex.
Outside of, I'll call it storytelling, right? So a lot of these shops that we're talking about have some sort of communications mechanism. They might have a Facebook page or they might have an Instagram account, and that if that's it, that's still cool. But the storytelling, if the storytelling, larger storytelling and advocacy is one big challenge, what are some of the other sort of meta challenges that you're seeing or feeling? And I realize that's a really,
we could talk about funding and just our funding streams. I feel like that's an existential challenge, especially in this moment for a lot of folks I support and serve. But I do think the mindset just around conservation is interesting to explore, because I feel like we're at this moment where people are so attached to their phones, right? And their technology. And at the same time, we saw this in COVID, people are craving time in nature and are seeking it and are accessing it even more than they did before. And different types of folks, different demographics of people are getting out in nature. So I do think from a big picture standpoint, like one of the biggest shifts is just like, how are people connecting with each other and connecting with nature and in nature? And I feel like that's going to be a huge opportunity for the conservation community as we think about like the next 10, 20 years and beyond.
I think you and I were at a conference recently and collectively agreed that it was the best data presentation we'd ever seen, which is for the two of us, for anybody who knows us, who are already data nerds.
Total data nerds.
the idea of having an exciting data presentation was like a whole new level. But recently, the Outdoor Foundation released its participation report for 2024, and what Megan and I were watching and listening to was the breakdown of the demographics of how people are getting outside. And this might seem super obvious to someone who hasn't had their head deep in it before, but there was sort of this breakdown, this new realization, this understanding that the biggest section of the bell curve is really just an active population. We talk so much about sort of core outdoor people and casual outdoor people, and the reality is the big chunk of the bell curve, and 90+% of us fall into that. It's part of life, and I think that's the chunk that's growing more and more.
Yeah, and then the question is like, well, how do we design for that? Like, if that's what people really want, and I can put my, recovering community planner hat on when I ask that question, or my conservation hat on. But, I just got back from Montreal, had a family vacation there, and I felt the same way there that I feel when I go to Savannah, where it's like you can walk for 2 blocks and there's going to be a park there. And it's a park that has trees, shaded areas to sit, picnic tables, benches, maybe a water feature. But it's not, and maybe some trails or pathways, but it's not designed for programming. It's just designed as a space for people to relax and just pause. But you can actually feel your heart rate change, like when you walk into these spaces, no matter how large or small they are. So I think about how we design our cities here, and we don't really have a lot of cities designed like that. I mean, despite having and claiming like Olmsted and Oglethorpe as ours, and Montreal like designed around those same principles, but it's like, how are we actually doing this and creating these spaces so that we can be healthy and happy within a couple blocks from where we work, or, our kids go to school, or, a hospital facility, or our college, or our house. So I think about those things a lot. And I think that ties into the urban conservation interest that folks have. It's like, how are we designing places for people and for health?
Yeah, I think so often it's assumed, especially in more populated areas, that whether exurban or cityscapes, that unused, unprogrammed space is wasted space. Like it's waiting to be filled, and sometimes it's really not. It's space for people to gather. It's space for people to breathe, literally breathe. It's space for people to cool down, to meet one another. Doesn't always have to have a grand purpose. Doesn't always have to have some major programming attached to it. I think it's really a smart point.
Some of the coolest places in Montreal were the alleys by Duluth Street, where they had just, like, you walk down the alley. I walked down one that had a playground right next to it. And it was, people's homes. These are mostly like kind of like row house style houses or duplexes, 2 or 3 stories tall. But the alleys have this beautiful green canopy. So you can go from this really busy feeling street that's sort of like you can feel the heat, coming from the asphalt. And you walk into these alleys and it's like 10 degrees cooler. And you feel like you're in a park. But I mean, this isn't what we think about when we think about conservation. But these are the kinds of design principles that, make a difference in terms of our experience of heat, when we're in a community, or air quality, helping with things like runoff. Like, they had a lot of pollinator gardens that they were also using to manage stormwater runoff, like right in the city. And we don't see a lot of that in a lot of our communities. We don't invest in that kind of public infrastructure as much as some other places do.
Yeah, I think I had a similar sort of smaller scale realization recently. I was in the city of Jackson, and I think most people know Jackson County, either for Consumers Energy or for prison. And being in downtown Jackson in particular, the intentional efforts to create those kinds of spaces, and that feeling you're talking about was really there as well. Like, you could turn a corner, and in this case, it was also a lot of the alleyways. You could turn a corner and you could take a deep breath. And it's palpable on how you feel, and it's palpable on how you're reacting to other people as well. And I think that feeling is, not just, I think that feeling is something that we assume others have access to and have the ability to get to. And many times they don't. And so that's where kind of a lot of that work leads us. So it was, let's see, close to 3 years ago, maybe a little bit more now. You'd done some work with Heart of the Lakes as well as the Mott Foundation, taking a look at the very wonkily what we called it, the state of urban conservation at the time. Curious if there's some memories that kind of flip back from that era, and then some things maybe that you've seen change or not since then.
Yeah, I mean, I think things are continuing on in a similar trajectory. It does seem like one of the key takeaways from that assessment we worked on together was that, most land trusts traditionally work in more rural areas or on large, like landscape level, large acreage projects. And the folks who are doing what we think of as urban conservation are oftentimes different organizations, not necessarily land trusts, but are like parks groups, friends groups, coalitions of parks groups, or watershed councils. And in terms of the division of roles, that still seems to be kind of playing out in the space. I have seen some different types of partnership conversations emerge between folks who are working in sort of the first string suburb areas, primarily related to public access to rivers, related to things like water trail development and like kayak launches. So I think about like these spaces where maybe these entities touch, where maybe their roles and goals and maybe their special sauce aligns. And I do see some of those types of collaborative efforts or efforts that just complement each other's strengths coming through.
I think some of the recent places I've been very privileged to get to spend time with groups on the ground all around the state. And sort of like when I look at like Saginaw River Headwaters Rec Area, or I think about Rouge Park in Detroit, or I think about the work that Friends of Grand Rapids Parks is doing, thinking about how like these multiple entities are able to show up and really proudly speak for these places. And a lot of it is, I think you're right, based on access to water, access to the river systems. And that also gives the opportunity for people to engage in the way that's appropriate for them. If I want to sit by the river, and that's what does it for me, that's totally okay. If I want to try and paddle class 3 rapids in a river, that's okay too. If I want to fish, if I want to hang out, it kind of doesn't matter. It's a very welcoming space for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do think for like organizations, it's good to know what you're good at. It's good to know your lane. And I'm a fan of, partnerships are really hard. Everything takes longer. Communication can, especially if you're working across sectors, can be challenging just because there are different expectations and barriers and constraints that folks are facing. So a lot of these efforts just take a lot of time too. So like 3 years isn't a lot of time when you're trying to work on some kind of complex partnership together on the ground, especially if it involves working with a landowner and trying to negotiate an option to buy something before you can even go out and fundraise to, secure the money to close the deal, and then, maybe make the place what you want it to be in terms of public access or improvement. So a lot of these things can take from start to finish, it might take 5 years before an idea becomes an action step that someone can go, put their kayak in the water. So I think there are a lot of seeds planted, and I think there are good things happening. And I think that also just ties into this challenge around the funding, because the funding streams, at least at the federal level, and because of that in private philanthropy, are just so uncertain for so many folks right now. And I think it makes that long-range planning harder when you have this uncertainty, even with grant programs that maybe used to be, competitive, but sort of reliable. You kind of knew if you applied and you met these criteria that you might get funded. So I think that is going to change the way people even approach projects that they might even want to put in a pipeline.
There's a mutual friend of ours who works in fundraising and development who recently shared it's maybe not so hidden secret that potentially the nonprofit space is oversaturated. With that in mind, and with challenges to funding, is the space oversaturated? I mean, is there an argument can be made that if community really wanted these things, then they would support them from an individual level. And so I think what we're seeing right now is a challenge with government programs and philanthropies, limited resources. So I'm sort of asking that to bait the conversation, but is the space oversaturated? Shouldn't it be able to survive on its own?
Yeah, I mean, if you think just about why nonprofits exist, like they exist to provide a public service that government can't or won't provide. So I think we as a community get to decide first if we want the service, and then if we think it should be us collectively as the government paying for that service, or if we want to pay for it privately. So I think that's the choice we have as community members. And sometimes we say yes to both, right? Like a community, a township in, you know, around Ann Arbor or on Old Mission could tax itself and vote for a millage to protect farmland and then also support their local land trust, with a private donation. So, I mean, sometimes we do both. But I do think the saturation question is interesting because I think what I'm seeing right now is that even organizations that used to feel stable before now are feeling a lot more pressure because the demand in every single segment of service, whether it's healthcare or arts and culture or housing or trail development and maintenance or conservation, everybody's funding is shifting. Public funding is shifting. So it's not just like, oh, well, we have, quote, too many organizations working on conservation. It's like, well, everybody has greater need now, and it's putting a bigger burden on private philanthropy because of that. So I kind of feel like, if you're feeling consistent pressure over time, like if you're always struggling to raise money and you're never really feeling like you can achieve your goals as an organization, that's probably a good time to think about whether you need to unwind or merge. But if you're just having like the normal challenges of like raising money for a capital campaign or something like that, like I think those are normal tensions. But I do think as our appetite to have public funding shifts, it'll place a bigger burden on these nonprofits for sure.
I like how you very politely use the term unwind, which especially in the organizational development space is the wink wink nudge nudge for maybe you should close. Is it because of the attachment to place, specifically in conservation and outdoor rec and things like that? Is it the attachment to place that makes it so difficult for people to make hard business decisions? Is it because they're giving of themselves? Is it all of the above? Like, why has it become so, why unwind is even just a really nice way to be like, you should let go quicker. But unwinding is still like the long Midwest goodbye even.
Right. Yeah. Takes 30 minutes to say goodbye at the party. Yep.
Yeah.
I would say a lot, like most nonprofits started with a small group of people who were passionate about something, right? Who gave them of themselves without getting paid to fulfill some purpose that they felt was really important, that was going to make an impact on their community. So it's like when you start from that point, it's sort of like, it's your child. And it's like hard to let go as a parent, right? So I think some of it's just the natural affection that people have for the things that they've started and that they've given themselves to, like every part of themselves and their time and their, everything. So I think some of it's just normal human reaction, not wanting to let go. And change is also just really hard organizationally, even if you weren't one of the founders. Just the gravity of the decision making involved with having to make that change and then also communicate that change to other people who are going to be impacted by it. Like that can feel really painful, uncomfortable to folks. And, as humans, we like seek pleasure and avoid pain. And having to share bad news with people or news that feels uncomfortable to them is not something we're usually wanting to lean into. So I think it just comes down to that a lot of times. This change is really hard.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it's not as massive as an ongoing dopamine hit. Sometimes it's just the avoidance of not wanting to be hurt and not wanting to share it, quite frankly.
Or hurt other people. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If funding is one measure, not necessarily of success, but of sort of business stability. When we're thinking about the work of watershed management, when we're thinking about access to outdoor recreation, when we're thinking about land protection, how do we know when we're doing well? I mean, that sounds really dumb, but like, how do we know when we're actually achieving success? Is there a marker for that?
Yeah, so this is interesting because I was having a conversation with a client about measurements of success just this week, and we were talking about it in light of some of the funding changes. And, this is a group that has been involved in dam removal and restoration efforts, and their prioritization process for that has really focused on water quality, but from like a habitat lens, looking at like brook trout population, things like that. So, like fish habitat. And, if the funding shifts toward maybe not funding those types of things anymore through the type of funding streams they've had to something more like climate resiliency, where maybe there's more of a focus on projects that help to reduce flooding impacts in communities or something like that. That's going to change what the measurement of success looks like, for the community and for the organization. So I think for some conservation organizations, that can feel hard because it feels like you're still doing the work, like you're still doing conservation work, but you're not able to focus on protecting maybe like the best of the best or the things that you really want to be focusing on because the money's just not there to do it. But you're still doing conservation and it's still really good work, right? And it's still having a positive impact. But it's like, how do you measure success? It might change, or it might have to change just based on the resources that are available. So success might look different depending on capacity.
I think too, it's very hard. Like a lot of the work, um, there's different layers. Like right, so the work impacts individuals, it impacts households, it impacts families, it impacts entire communities, and I think it becomes really hard to. Um, it's easy to talk about marketing materials that open space brought joy to someone's life. But I challenge anyone to report back to a government funding source or a philanthropic funding source that they brought joy, and then to use that as their justification for more work, right? So I think where some of the challenge comes in and kind of the tension point is this idea that like there's an inherent human value to the impact of the work, but we don't have, and maybe arguably shouldn't have, tools to measure joy and a deep breath. And so we turn to things like, oh, it decreased blood pressure. Okay, great. But the real feeling behind that was there was some joy and there was some feeling of life and satisfaction in where I'm living. And I think that's where we run into some real deep challenges, is how to get away from, even when we talk about outcome evaluation, how do we get away from this idea of like, oh, we changed the statistics on X, Y, and Z. It's still back to numbers versus that really human benefit and that human value. I certainly don't have an answer for that.
No, I think that's a really interesting. And when I think about like you were asking about, is a community willing to support something enough that it won't fail? I think that is one measure of success. It might not always have the financial resources to support a nonprofit in the way that it needs to survive. But when I think about conservation, I think conservation is so much bigger than our organizations and institutions. Like it's really about our relationship with nature and each other. So like a metric of success for conservation might mean that I and my family members and my neighbors all have the knowledge and the capacity to be able to take care of and steward whatever place we're part of and do it in a way that respects that ecosystem that we're part of, and that we experience joy in that space. Like we find ourselves in that place. We feel like we're connected to it and we're part of it. I don't know how to measure that. But you do know it when you feel it. You know it when you're part of a community that's doing that. I think we see that on some preserves, that land conservancies steward and host. And I know over the years, there have been different ways of describing what those places are. We've used the term, community-based conservation or ambassador landscapes or, different terminology to talk about it. But it's the places where you see people connecting with the place in a way that's beyond just, quote, using it for recreation. It's like really having that connection and being involved in its care and stewardship and having like a reciprocal relationship with the place. And I don't know how to measure that. I mean, like volunteer stats and ours don't really do that well. But the stories are probably the best way to capture it,
Yeah, I mean, the work Center for Rural Communities for a couple of decades now has spent time trying to answer that question, and a lot of that originated out of the what do we let's move beyond bucks and acres as measures of success. And I still don't think we got there yet. Maybe we shouldn't. I mean, maybe we should sort of acknowledge the inherent social benefits and human values. Maybe they don't always need to be spelled out that specifically, but it does feel like a missing opportunity to connect with more people. If my work brings you joy and health in your life, what greater impact could be had? To your point, versus volunteer hours and how many people showed up. I think one of the other things, to go back to our Mississippi reference, when I talked to a lot of our colleagues west of the Mississippi, in particular, and some of this has to do with the mountain landscapes, but they don't separate outdoor recreation and conservation quite the same way that we seem to east of the Mississippi, or at least in our Midwest region. And I'm still unsure what to do with that, in the sense that being an outdoor person or being outdoorsy shouldn't necessarily have to draw the line between whether I like to do things outside or whether I like to help conserve outside. The two of them, to me, often feel one and the same. I'm curious if you see that with some of the groups that you're working with. Are they drawing a line, and if are they even acknowledging a line? They want to put a line in place, and if not, how are they bridging that?
I feel like a lot of, if you ask someone in the community where they like to go hike, they'll tell you. And they probably won't know whose trail it is or who's managing it. But I think a lot of the separation or division is just in the way our management structures are set up. So, we actually have in the Midwest, and especially Michigan, different entities responsible for, quote, conservation and outdoor recreation. So even down to the way our counties and our cities and also just our nonprofit organizations function. So I think it's sort of natural for those organizations to focus on the thing that they're feel responsible and have agency for governing. I think, again, it just goes back to how do we, and you lead in this space and talk about this, how do we create the big tent, so folks can actually connect and build those bridges together to make sure people's visions and kind of work plans are aligned, and that we're all telling the broader story together. Because, I moved to Northern Michigan because I wanted to be close to nature, but I didn't really know a lot about who was doing what up here until I, got into the work. But I do think a lot of people care about both. They care about conservation. They care about nature. If you're hiking, somewhere in Leelanau County, you might not know a lot about invasive species or forest health, but that a trillium is beautiful if you see it in the spring, and you can appreciate the ephemerals, the wildflowers that are there. But it's that bridge. It's like creating that bridge between the person experiencing nature and then understanding, what does it take to keep that forest healthy? And who's working on that? How can you help? I think some of that's just that bridging is still something we're all working on together.
I think as we're recording this, the Leelanau Conservancy is headed towards formal and permanent acquisition of the former Sugarloaf Ski Resort in Leelanau County. And I think that's been it. For me, at least, it's been fascinating to watch the general public sort of react to what the property can become in the future. So we have on sort of either extreme, almost back to that bell curve, we have the needs to be, downhill, hardcore downhill alpine skiing. We don't need no tree huggers. And then there's a little tiny segment on the other end, which is thank heavens we finally protected this place from all the people that want to invade it. And there's a giant bell curve in the middle, the giant chunk of it, the active, who are really looking at it. And they're like, what a great opportunity to embrace both the place, the species that are there, the conservation ethic, and then also ways for people to engage with it. So it's been really fascinating to watch that play out in real time. And not just locally either, the conversation, because of its the place's historic significance in the Midwest, and watching those conversations occur in the Chicago Tribune and then the Detroit News and places where geography is not related, but it's a real point of interest for people to kind of figure out where they balance on it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just, I'm excited about that project as a local resident, thrilled about it, and really interested to see how, they'll approach these types of conversations related to use, because it can be really challenging, especially as a land conservancy, to balance the recreational use interests of different user groups from, hikers, hunters, anglers, mountain bikers, photographers, plein air painters, yoga enthusiasts, whatever, pick your outdoor recreation opportunity with the desire to protect a place. And for a long time, I think there was this sort of ethos among conservation groups. It's like this idea of protecting land from people and not for people. And I think as more conservancies sort of wade into this space of protecting places with an intention to create outdoor recreation, they're the vanguards of helping to figure out how to do that well.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the danger becomes in one or the other. A lot from kind of the purist conversation. It's like, well, I don't want mountain bikers ripping up my my coastal sand dune. Right. And it's sort of like my response back to that is, well, I don't either. There's this idea of place first, which we talk a lot about. It's identifying what the right approach is for each place and recognizing the value of the place, followed by how people get to interact with it versus just sort of an open gate everywhere.
Humans, we shouldn't be everywhere. Just because we exist doesn't mean we should be able to access every place and use it the way we want to. I think it's not super respectful to the ecosystem to think that way, that just because something's there that it's ours. But I do think conservancies, I think the policies that make sense for them are the ones that create spaces where that kind of recreation use can happen and it makes sense for it to happen, but also just setting aside spaces that are sanctuaries where nature is just existing for nature, or some kind of restoration project is happening where, humans are not encouraged or desired to go. So I feel like as community members, we need to respect that, and then as recreation users, it's like, it's okay if we're not protecting this for our recreational pleasure, but for some other purpose that also benefits, the entire system that we're part of. So I think it's just like having a greater respect for that whole system and not just the recreation use that I actually think the outdoor recreation community could be doing a great job of championing.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. It's I think the Park Service refers to it as zonal management, if I remember right, where it's like, there are different intense uses for different places, and sometimes no use is one of those things.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that, to draw from your planning examples before, that works really well in Chandler Park in Detroit. It works really well for Arcadia Dunes. It works like at different scales. It works well for a national forest. That ability to sort of assign, maybe we don't need to be everywhere all the time.
Well, Arcadia Marsh, too, another Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy preserve, they have this beautiful boardwalk that's accessible for most of the year, except during the nesting season. So you can go and enjoy yourself there, except you can't use the boardwalk when it's a sensitive time for the birds who call that place home. So I think that's the kind of thing we just need to celebrate.
Absolutely. The fact that you ran from Ohio just to come to Michigan, I think is an important thing we should highlight. But
yeah, I like to say Ohio was a good place to be from, and my dad actually played football for Indiana. I told you I wasn't going to talk about football, but now I'm going to talk about football. But my dad was Indiana Hoosier. So we did not cheer for Ohio State in my house growing up, even though I grew up in Columbus, Ohio.
One of my
Dad, if you're listening, go Hoosiers.
One of my favorite references, Megan and I were talking. There's a small town northeast Columbus metro area called Delaware, and the Delaware Ecological Center is down a gravel road. It's where I've actually met a number of our colleagues from Ohio. Chris Bunch, also, who was previously working in Ohio. It's the first time I met Chris down in Delaware. Turns out that Megan also has a Delaware Ecological Center like touch point, which is just great that this little town and this very small nature center have such organizational reach.
Oh yeah, guys, I was a farm intern there while I was in college. So this was part of some work I did my junior year of college. I was working at Stratford as a farm intern, where I'll tell you a short story. It's a funny one. This is where I learned I was not going to be a farmer. So the farm manager, great guy, his name is Steve. In the morning we got our assignments, we went out and did them. I grew up in the suburbs and didn't really even know how to drive a stick shift before I went to work on this farm. So you have to imagine me driving a tractor, right? First of all. So it was already a challenge. But Steve was like, I need you to take the lime spreader and go out and, spread lime in those fields. So I did, but there was a really tight turn back there, steep slope heading into the creek, and I backed over the lime spreader. Like I actually backed over it. And then I had to do this walk of shame back to the farm manager's house. And I was like, Steve, what do I do? And he just handed me a sledgehammer and said, go fix it. So I think that was pretty much the end of my farming life. But I did do my thesis work on local food systems. And I realized that my role in that food system approach was not going to be, I wasn't going to be doing Steve's job. But I learned a lot there. I learned a lot about organic and sustainable ag, and about how we can regionalize our food systems by, structuring markets differently locally. And there are a lot of great folks who went through that place, and great partnerships with the Ohio State University.
Yeah, no, I love, and that's, I think, a great example, right, of those places, the kinds of places that people have invested in and protected and have such a wide-ranging impact on a lot of lives. But we don't know it until later down the road. Like, it's not an immediate, like, oh, this is where the farm intern was. That's not, you and I did not meet there, but for all intents could have. But it still has kind of lasting memories and legacy for both of us. Where are opportunities to create that kind of legacy? It's no secret you're raising a household of very smart people who will take over the world. How do we help them? Like, what's 10 years? If 3 years is too short, what's 10 years from now look like? Where are we going to be able to enact some of that change that allows for these kinds of connections in the future?
I mean, I think going back to like the family, like one simple thing we can do with our kids is just take them out in nature with us. And like, that's a short-term win, right? It's like, if we are in our own choices every day, like choosing to spend time outside and spending time outside with our kids, and then they fall in love with the place, to me, that's how we succeed, as a society. Sometimes I think my kids felt, especially when they were younger, that I was kind of dragging them outside. Like, I remember bribing them with Skittles on a few different hikes. And they weren't even like fresh Skittles. I think they were stale ones. But, like, sometimes you do what you need to as a mom. It's like, it's just one more mile. You'll be fine. But I do think these are core memories that form for kids. It's like they'll remember those places, and they'll remember, maybe it's just like one tree that they remember that they really had an affection for, or a certain view. And I mean, I know I live in Northern Michigan and I'm privileged to be here, but I have teenage children, and they routinely will just like leave the house and go watch the sunset with their friends. And I think like knowing that they just have a place that they like to go with their people is, I think it's a sign of success when they're finding their place in nature where they want to. I think encouraging like the next generation of conservation leaders is really important too. And I think about this, like, I'm almost 50, and like sometimes people in their 20s like ask me for advice and stuff. And I'm like, why are you talking to me? Like, I don't know anything. But I do feel like, just like lifting up and learning from younger people is something we can do as mid-career or professionals or people who are like getting closer to retirement, and asking them like what matters most to them, because they're the future of the conservation movement, right? Or community development, and just tapping into their passion and their knowledge about place or what matters most. I think that's what's going to carry conservation forward, and then creating opportunities and pathways for them to have success and lead, whether it's, more training, professional training, or like formal mentorships or things like that, or just helping them build connections with other peers. I think that's really important. And just to do that within our organizations too. And just to embrace the change too, like organizations change and institutions change. And just like, I work with a lot of folks on succession planning for both staff leadership and board, and just embracing that process and thinking about change as normal, I think is just something we can encourage too. And, that might even tie into what you were talking about earlier with like, when do organizations need to unwind or evolve? It's like a merger doesn't have, sometimes people think of mergers as like something they have to do, but like, what if we thought of it as a way to advance something in an even more powerful way? I mean, I think we can encourage that mindset a little bit more. And there's always on the ground wins, to look forward to, like whether it's a new public access site or the Sugarloaf project that you were talking about earlier with Leelanau, or, there's amazing other initiatives happening in all parts of the state that folks are doing. Some of those are stalled out because of federal funding, but some are moving forward with private and state funding and support. Just need to prop those up more.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, it's get some dirt under your fingernails, get sweaty, volunteer. If you have the money to share and to support, do so. It does, to your point earlier, the work does come from and needs to be supported by the community made up of individuals. And I think a lot of our work often turns to like, how is government going to change it, or policy going to change, or philanthropy? And at the end of the day, it does rest with us as individuals.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think it goes back to like thinking about like governance as opposed to government. Like we can co-create governance models that get what we want. Government may or may not be part of that, or might have a different kind of role than what it did in the past, but we can still collaboratively govern our commons together.
Well, Megan, as you and I always have some really great conversations, and so I not only appreciate your time today, but I know that you personally and your company has impacted the way that a lot of people think about how this work is approached. So thank you so much for spending a little bit of your day with us today.
Thank you.
If people or organizations are interested in learning more about Parallel Solutions or want to work with you, how do they find you?
They can find me on my website, which is just www.parallelmi.com.
All right, we'll put that down in the show notes too. Well, Megan, thank you again. Big thanks as well to the C.S. Mott Foundation and the Conservation Fund for supporting Ramble Mosey. As always, thought leadership provided by Parallel Solutions. So we hope you enjoyed this conversation today. Production by Anna Moya, and I'm your host, Jonathan Rose. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform, Apple, Spotify, we're out there. And then tell your friends. So if you like the content you're hearing, feel free to send recommendations and suggestions back to us, and we'll dive into some of the change makers and tastemakers that you want to hear from. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy your day.